In this episode of Unpacked.
Home for me was not actually SA, it was Botswana.
It's easy for a person that doesn't know to hear one Exile story and then paint everybody with it.
My only little friends at crash were the other immigrant kids.
One of our houses was bombed.
There's so many misconceptions about the children who were raised in exile. Now, that's what we're going to be speaking about today. We've got two guests who were raised partly abroad but are back home. Let's find out what their journey was like. Husband, father, and proud South African Malusi Gwangwa was born in 1978 in Botswana. Being the son of an activist father, he was exiled together with his younger sister to the UK and the Netherlands for some years. The daughter of exile South African parents, Lebogile Mashile, was born in the United States of America. Known famously as an accomplished poet, performer, actress, and presenter, she carries the experiences and memories of life pre- and post-apartheid South Africa. Two stories of two South Africans raised in exile. Let's unpack. Joining us in studio, we have Malusi Gwangwa, and joining us via videocon, we have Lebo Mashile. Welcome to the show, guys. Thank you so much for coming to talk to us.
Thank you.
Malusi, let's start with you. Gwangwa is a known surname. So for those that don't know, give us the picture of how you are a Gwangwa.
Well, obviously because they're my parents. That's my mother and father. But Jonas Gwangwa is my father, and he's a musician, composer, director, renowned the world over, obviously for his activism, but fondly by most for his music. He's a jazz musician, South African jazz, but to me he's dad, you know, and I am number 4, as my mother would say. And there's quite a bit of a team of us in the family. But I'm one of the children that was exiled to the Netherlands with my younger sister Kitu. And I guess my story would start from, we were born in Botswana.
So before we get there, how's Lebo?
Yebo.
You are the Lebo Mashile. And I say this because, you know, if we're having a conversation about children that were raised in exile, there's a person who sees your face and goes, no, man, it can't be the same. They don't know that side of you. They know the poet. They know the performer. They know the actress. At what point, you know, give us the story of when we say the Lebo, outside of the fame aspect, who is Lebo?
So I was born in a city called Providence, Rhode Island in the United States. My parents went into exile. My father in 1968, he wanted to study engineering and couldn't as a black kid. Also, you know, was having some serious personal problems. You know, his parents were splitting up. His father was abusive, and it was just, my mother was an activist. She left in 1976. She was a law student at the University of the North, Teflop, and she came from a family of activists. So in the space of about 2 years, in the space of 2 years, 4 of them were in exile. They met in the United States, even though they're both from Soweto. Before Soweto, my family was from Sophia and Western Native Township and got relocated to Soweto. But they met in New York and then kind of went in exile from New York because New York was crazy in the late 70s. When they started a family, they decided to move to Rhode Island, and that's where I grew up. We lived there until 1995. But at different points in my childhood, I came back to South Africa. While my parents were studying when I was very small, I spent my formative years as a toddler in Soweto with my grandparents. So even though I was born in the US, my earliest memory of life is of leaving Soweto and arriving in America and seeing white people for the first time and not being able to speak English and rejoining my parents in the US, but missing Soweto because Soweto felt like home. And I mean, I spent the bulk of my childhood in the US.
It's
the
amazing
80s.
though, because a lot of people wouldn't even know that about you. The fact that you were born, just in terms of that you were born in the US, but that your earliest memories are actually here, which I'm wondering, is that the same for you? Are your earliest memories abroad or Mogoai? Because you were saying about Botswana. Let's pick up from Botswana.
Yeah, it's a bit weird because a lot of people, when we talk about exile, we refer to overseas. So, but we were born in Botswana. You know, that's my sister and I. And my memories, my earlier childhood memories are of Botswana. And I remember actually missing Botswana. So home for me was not actually SA, it was Botswana. So we grew up, obviously, we went in 88, we went to the UK, and then we moved from the UK to the Netherlands. And that's where I think I draw a lot of my teenage years more than anything. But I've always referenced Botswana as a place where I, you know, when we say we're going back home, that was a place that I remembered. And it's funny because it was a mixture of Muchudi and the village. And, you know, my parents traveled a lot because my dad was also, you know, quite active as a musician. And there were times when we did come into SA. And I remember Orlando, I remember my grandmother, I remember my cousin. But even then it was, you know, Botswana is my home. I remember seeing my passport for the first time and it's like, yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah.
You know, but yeah, the travels overseas, I mean, look, there's a lot that happened. There's a lot that we come back with, but I think the whole idea was for them to kind of not make it feel as though we're missing out on anything.
I'm curious about, I mean, Lebo's explained the circumstances, you know, for her being born in the States, and we'll get to, you know, the upbringing of Soweto, but what are the circumstances that you eventually had to now go to the UK, or that also that your parents found themselves having you in Botswana?
So, I mean, we were already in exile when we were in Botswana. And we're in exile because of my father's anti-apartheid, you know, activity. So they tracked us all the way to Botswana.
Wow.
You know, even when obviously you're old and you have the conversations with your parents, they're like, listen, your father used to drive around, you know, in the city and then drive around a circle, a traffic circle, over and over again, just to make sure that you're not being followed, and then go home. You know, so for us to leave Botswana to go to the UK, one of our houses was bombed. You know, they actually got there. I think my mother got notification from one of the family friends to say, hey, listen, we advise that you actually leave that house. And
no one was there, fortunately, when it happened.
Well, we managed to leave just before. We couldn't take anything. It was literally like, you know, pack up and go. And I remember going to school and passing by our house and everything was just flattened. You could see my father's piano, my mother's plant that used to go across the wall. That was, you know, and the next couple of weeks after that was a bit of a frenzy. We were relatively young, you know. I was I think around 6 years old.
So let's jump to that. Lebo, you mentioned that your earliest memories were in Soweto. Maybe, I don't know if it's even possible. What is your earliest childhood memory, and what was your perspective of what your life was at that moment?
My earliest childhood memory is of the day that my uncle and I were going to rejoin my parents in the US. And I remember the dog, go Soweto, maganja ganja. And I remember going to and I remember going to Rockville to say goodbye to my dad's people go Rockville. And I remember getting into the plane and seeing all these white people. And I remember we had a layover in Belgium and I saw snow for the first time. And I remember being so like freaked out by snow. It was those days where if you had a stopover, you could still get out of the airport. You know, this was like 82, 80, somewhere there. And I remember we got out so that I could see the snow, and the snow blew my mind, and I dropped my teddy bear in the snow, and this white cop gave me my teddy bear back, and I was terrified of the white cop, you know, and just that transition was such a it was mind blowing to me, you know. And I remember getting to America, and my father used to talk about how he used to overhear me saying to my uncle, like, "Re ba bone batho ba, okay, re tjhakile, like, okay, when are we going back? You know, like we've done this thing, you know, when are we going back?" And my father used to talk about how that really broke his heart, you know. I mean, even listening to Malusi talk about being 6 years old and your home being blown up, and like we like wash over things because I think we are so used to harrowing trauma in this country, you know, that we kind of speak about it matter of fact, but it's actually trauma, you know.
When you were now having this experience, you're getting on the plane, a cop is giving you, it's like culture shock, you're overwhelmed. Did you know why you were going at that time? Because obviously the stories our parents had to tell us when we were younger are very different from the actual realities.
No, I had no clue. It was an adventure for me. I was like, wow, we in a plane. Yo, hey, snow, makua. Woo! I remember sitting next to a white lady in the plane, and she was like helping to feed me. You know, I guess because I'm with my uncle and he's a dude, and you know what I mean? And maybe, I don't know, she intervened because here's this little kid. And I was like, oh, wow, white lady, white people, white things, white plane, white snow. You know, it was, I just remember the onslaught of whiteness. It felt like whiteness was swallowing me, you know? And I mean, it was a stark change in realities, you know, to go from Soweto and then finding myself in Rhode Island, being the only Black kid at a creche and not being able to speak English, and the trauma of that, and the trauma of racism that I really didn't have a language for, you know? My only little friends at creche were the other immigrant kids. There was a girl whose parents were from Colombia. There was another girl whose parents were from India. Those are the only people who would even play with me, who would talk to me, you know?
I actually was about to ask you that, did you understand, because obviously you're overwhelmed, like in your words, the whiteness. Did you already associate white with something you're afraid of at that age? Or was it just, this person doesn't look like me? I don't know if I'm making sense with what I'm asking.
I hear what you mean. I hear what you mean. I in my mind, I didn't have a language for it. But I think my psyche, my subconscious internalized it as trauma. I had recurring nightmares as a child of being chased by police officers. Kgothatso Legwale, you know? And I mean, that happened for years of being, you know, chased by police officers. Sometimes the officers were animals that were chasing me, but always in uniform, always coming after me, always, you know, wanting to harm me. And I didn't understand what that was, but I think it was my little mind trying to make sense of all these worlds that were colliding, you know? My parents really tried to help us understand the politics of South Africa, and they did a very good job at conscientizing us. But what they couldn't explain was their own trauma, their own sadness, their own depression, their own longing for home, you know, the weight of that, what that felt like. That was an energy that was alive in my house, but it never had a language, you know. And I think that's part of the reason why I became an artist, to try to find language for the things that are unsayable, but that are felt.
You know what I love about what you're saying, which is, I think, very critical just for any individual to know and understand, is you said your parents could never explain their trauma. Because the way I see it, they couldn't even interpret it. It's almost like there are so many coping mechanisms that we see in our families as Batwabantu. We don't know where they come from, and yes, because we're a bit more woke, we're putting names to it, but they haven't even processed that. So for them to be able to explain that to you as a kid as to why we're leaving, I mean, it's a different experience for you. You saw the house gone, you ran away, but could you actually understand why? Did you understand that it was specifically targeted, or was it just like, no, okay, maybe it's an adventure, we're going somewhere else?
No, I mean, look, I think my story is a bit different from Lebo because we'd already had interactions with white people. You know, my mother was in British Airways, not British Airways, Botswana Air back then. And we got invited to gigs, parties, whatever, you know, and there were interactions already. So
And it wasn't.
I questioned it.
It wasn't scary interactions. Just so I can understand, because if your initial interaction with a white person is violent or whatever else it may be, when you have it again, there'll be that thing. So are you saying your interactions where you were guests, it wasn't a scary experience?
It wasn't scary from I'm fearful.
Yeah.
I did notice that there was a bit of a difference from, because the one family I was too young to really, I've got pictures of me as a kid, but just before we left, there was this, because we moved around in Botswana, there's a family we went to stay next to, and it was a bit of an open field, Botswana, and I used to like crossing over to their yard, and there was this young Afrikaner kid there, a white boy, and all I could say then was, come here, for every single word. Like, come here, come here, come here, come here, and that was the closest I had gotten to, realizing that I'm with a white person. But when we got, I relate with Lebo, because when we got to the UK, that cold will tell you you're not home.
Ish.
Okay, that cold will, because, and for me, I was constantly having to relate what was happening to my sister. That was also the other thing. So while my parents were trying to figure out what was going on, she was asking me the questions.
How old was she in relation to you at the time?
She's 2 years younger than me, so, 4, 5. And her questions were exactly that.
Wow.
Are we done now? Can we go back home? And it became an ongoing, it's an extended holiday. It's an extended holiday. It's an extended holiday. So I was angry, because I felt removed, forcefully, but I had to almost hide that from her, because I didn't feel like she needed to be where I was, because I could see what was happening to my parents. It was throwing them for a loop. Every single thing we did, it almost like they had to decide on the spot. So there wasn't time to tell a story. There wasn't time to say, hey, this is what's happening. You met a new uncle every day, you stay with them. There's a time we got left at the airport for hours. And we're just, going from uncle to uncle, uncle to uncle at Heathrow while they were trying to sort out, us going in there. So half the time it wasn't like a smooth story that we can tell from A to, it got jerked around many times. And I guess I'm lucky I had her, because I can only imagine for those kids that were in exile by themselves.
And I think what's important, like obviously when, before we started recording, I said to myself, thank you, universe, thank you, the world works in mysterious but amazing ways. That I try my best not to read too much before we have a conversation, because I need to keep my inquisitive mind. And because I know you both personally, I also want to experience this for the first time. But I think what was so beautiful is how your stories are so different. It's easy for a person that doesn't know to hear one exile story that might have sounded a little bit glamorous and then paint everybody with it. Hence, I said, let's have this conversation, because I don't think it was all rosy for the children. You had a completely different experience, and your poor parents, like what you say, for you guys, it was constant running at any moment. Would you then say, and I'm fast forwarding to today, has that affected you just in terms of anxieties around stability? Like, do you have those weird fears? And I'm going to ask Lebo the same question of like never feeling grounded, never feeling like, do you have those feelings?
Yes and no.
Yeah.
Yes, because exile was very much about finding your community. It was finding your family and finding it quickly. Like, I make friends very quickly, but I also let go of them easier, because we had to do that constantly. But and that's part of the anxiety I have now. That, relationships are very hard to kind of let settle in. And we even celebrated being back home longer than being in exile.
Wow.
But I have a bit of a twist in my story, in that we ended up in the Netherlands, where my sister and I got probably the best experience for what being at home within a proper family. I'm not saying that what my parents did was, not proper, but we went to school, we had friends.
Consistency, security, stability.
You know, and
Okay.
the only controversy with that is it was in the Netherlands. And I was already aware of the Afrikaner history. I was aware of, you know, the Dutch. And so it took some time for me to kind of, you know, get used to it. But my sister, funny enough, that's where she opened up. That's where she really found herself. Because you could see also in the things that she was doing, she got the language quicker, you know, and it's those things that make you realize now that you can't really hold on to the stuff that, you know, gave you challenges back then, but all they do is just really create another layer that you can reference off. So it's easier for me to make friends, and it's even easier for me to say, listen, I can't hold on to you as a friend, so I give you the right to decide what you want to do with the relationship. But because of that, I've traveled with the idea that anybody can
go at any time.
Yeah, I mean, you know, and unfortunately, that was a big part of Exile as well, that, you know, you'd meet with somebody and then when you ask about them, they were like, no, they're not around anymore, you know. And
I'm going to come back to that one because I think also we need to get an understanding of that shift because you're going through different stages of your childhood and upbringing while all of this is happening. But the same question to you, Lebo, did you find that you had any type of anxieties about, you know, the things, you know, being changed? I don't know if the word would be abandonment issues, its stability issues. Did you... I would almost even say I would describe you both as adult children because yet you find yourself growing up and worrying about things that your average child didn't have to deal with.
It is very much like that. I mean, as Malusi was speaking, like so much of what he is saying resonates with me. It went straight into my heart, you know, the ability to be able to form relationships very, very quickly and open up very quickly, but almost just as quickly be able to let things go and be able to let people go, places go permanently. Like I've seen the world change color overnight more times than I can count in my life. You know, I've been in and out of planes from the age of 18 months, you know. This COVID period is probably the longest period in my adult life that I have not been packing a suitcase to go somewhere, you know? And I mean, like you were saying, Malusi, you know, even my family, we also celebrated. We've been back now 25 years. You know, this is the longest. It's now like we've been, my parents' family, everybody has been back in South Africa for longer than the exile period, you know? And it's a mind trip for me, you know? So definitely the place where I feel the most rooted, the most anchored, the most solid, the place where I know South Africa is a home and a house for my identity. All of my ancestors are from here, are buried here, you know, this is where I'm from. But there's a sense in which I am always prepared for reality to change. I'm always ready for things to shift at a moment's notice. And you're right. That forced me to grow up very, very quickly, you know. And I think also what, you know, we don't talk a lot about, as you mentioned, coping mechanisms, you know. I remember growing up and, you know, like Malusi was saying, you know, there were always uncles, aunts, people coming in and out of our home. You know, when you're in exile, you are so happy to see other South Africans, you know? So everybody who is activisting and working and building with your parents becomes like extended family. Every South African who's passing through that area, who's studying in that area becomes an extended family member who comes, who goes, who leaves, who brings things from home. I mean, we would get so excited to get like lion matches, le acha, le papa, it's on South Africa from whoever was coming, you know. But the other side of that was also seeing the ways in which the same community was coping with trauma. So there was a lot of drinking in that community. And I remember thinking as a child, okay, these people must be drinking so much because they're sad to be away from home, you know. And I remember being conscious of that. I remember thinking that at like 7, 8, you know, like very young. And then when we came back to South Africa, I was like, no, everybody's drinking like this here.
Wow. And you know, we laugh about it, but how scary is it to think that your average child will understand how alcohol is medicine when they're much older? It's the kids
Oh, yes.
who maybe have been raised in homes where alcohol is an issue that understood that. And already knowing that, plus responsibility onto you that you should not have.
Oh, yeah. And understanding very well, Hore, there's a window of time when people are drinking where you are safe, you know, or where before things get hectic, before the vibe changes, before the room changes, before the energy changes, you know, you've got a window. And even now, as an adult, I'm very aware of it. If I didn't have that experience as a child, you know, I think that experience helped me even as an artist to understand like the clubs and gigs, you know, there's a window of time when the audience is still okay before things get too lit, you know. When things get too lit, you need to make a plan. You either need to get out or you need to get lit with them. But, you know, you can't this is your safety window. This is when you can get stuff done. This is when you can perform. This is when people are okay to be around. After that, diabo.
There's so many things coming up that I never thought would come up, but that is deep. We're coming back to that. Okay, so now you're in the UK. Did you know where you were? Like, did you understand? And I'm thinking about when I first understood a globe. Like, when I understood this is where I am. Like, what was that moment for you that you knew where you were on the globe in relation to where you were before? Or did you just know you're on a long flight, but you couldn't actually, you know, if I'm making sense, the globe moment, when was that for you?
I understand it, and no, I didn't have a clue how far I was, according to the globe, you know. But I do remember how, you know, it was irritating how different things were. You know,
in what sense?
The language, for instance, you know, you could hear the accents. I mean, this is in the 80s, you know, London in the 80s, there were, you know, Cockney accents all over the place. It was cold, you know, it was gloomy, the whole cliche. But there's one thing that irritated me specifically because I was coming from a place where there was sand everywhere. You understand? This is bricks everywhere. Do you understand? Like a piece of grass doesn't stick out from nowhere. It's bricks, and the only place you have some sort of sand is a park. And there's, you know, dog feces everywhere. You can't do anything. Literally,
it's so
like
amazing
you can't
that
play.
Your memory is so clear on that specific thing. But share with us, what did sand represent that you remember that so clearly? Why was sand so important?
Sand for me, it stayed a memory actually until now. Sand, for one, as a kid, I used to like eating sand, which is, yes.
And that's another episode.
Yeah.
Okay.
But there was a lady that used to take care of us, go Botswana when my parents were away, because half the time either my dad is traveling, you know, or my mother's got her responsibilities at Botswana. So she used to take care of us when we come back from school, feed us, wash us, and I was the one that was always playing outside in the sand, you know. So, and I didn't like taking a bath, so I'd come running in, but before getting to the house, I'd go to the tap outside and kind of wash just the front of my body.
Thinking no one would know.
Yes. So it became like a family story, especially when we met family overseas, and it was like, oh, Malusi, remember the sand? You used to like playing. So I didn't have that. I didn't have that relationship with the soil. I mean, and it's an ongoing thing. You know, you never miss somebody that is going to talk about where you come from if they notice, or if you're talking about Africa, that's not going to make relevance to son of the soil. You know, so that stayed with me, even in the Netherlands. You know, but in the UK more specifically because it was really just bricks everywhere. So I missed the heat. You know, Botswana is hot. I missed the dust. I missed my friends. I missed being able to just walk out the gate and just run off into the distance and not have anybody. Here you had somebody knock on your door, can Malusi please come out to play? You know, and like I made friends, but it wasn't the same. You know, so, and I was already at that age where I realized that, look, you know, this thing might be like this for a while. And my sister is still asking questions.
Were the people cold as well?
No. Like I said, I made friends fairly quickly. and even now it's easy for me to mix with any culture, race. I don't have that barrier, and that's one thing I think Exile also removed from me, which becomes difficult this side because race is such a big divider. Whereas that side, you don't have actually the option. If you choose to have those kind of barriers up, socially you become dead, and we had friends from India. I mean, I had Indian friends. I had, we stayed in a neighborhood, what was it called? Gospel Oak, which was a pretty okay, neighborhood. And I remember going with one of my friends from school whose mother was the tea lady. And they stayed in a not so okay neighborhood. But, just how she would treat me reminded me of back home, that you kind of get rid of that whole in-between part that people seem to focus on. So I don't have that. I don't have, they were cold and I needed to distance myself. But it's also what my parents were constantly teaching us as well, that this wasn't something that we wanted to continue and become a fight. This was, we're the same, we come from such same backgrounds that I actually didn't have that at all, So,
in the case of you, Lebo, what was your globe moment?
Oh, wow. I think probably in the mid to late 80s, when during the state of emergency in South Africa, when South Africa was always on the news. And when South Africa would come on the news, it was like the mood in the house would change, the images that were coming out of South Africa were harrowing images of violence. And then, this is America in the 80s, like Reagan, Bush, this is the Republicans who were calling the ANC terrorists who didn't want to divest from South Africa. So you had a very conservative government, and also Black people's lives in the US were under siege at that time. This was the peak of the crack epidemic, So it was like seeing the violence at home replicated in the violence in the communities that were around us, and how that would affect my family, like emotionally. We never called South Africa, So. And it was strange for me, like, to be like, so we always, if somebody called from South Africa, it was like, oh yeah, muthu wako haya wa phone, or if somebody's visiting from South Africa, muthu wako haya wa ta, or and I think when I was maybe about 8, 9, 10, realizing, oh wait, this is home, but home is down there. We were in New England in the Northern Hemisphere, so like the northeast of North America, and then South Africa right at the bottom of Africa. It felt like a world away. But the town where I grew up in also, like Malusi, I can relate. The town where I grew up in has a huge number of immigrants. So I grew up around kids who were from all over the world. Literally, like from the Cape Verde, from West Africa, from the West Indies, from Latin America, from Southeast Asia, from Eastern Europe, we all kind of met at US culture, America, Nike, MC Hammer, Bart Simpson, you know what I mean? But everybody went home to speak a funny language and eat funny food, and everybody, and I had a funny name and I had the biggest butt in the world, but, it was, now that I look back on it, I'm like, okay, I was different in my own way, but I was surrounded by so many people who were also different in many ways. And I feel very blessed for that. I feel very blessed that I had the experience of, one, being Black in a country where Blackness was under siege in the same way that it's very much under siege in South Africa. I feel like the US was really great preparation psychologically, emotionally, politically for South Africa, and it also forced me to expand my definition of blackness, like being black, but being black from the very beginning was always Pan-African, because the images of blackness that surrounded me came from everywhere, So I really...
Did you understand that at that time, though? Because I know there's things that happen to us that then we become woke and we're like, oh, so that thing was this. In that moment when you were living it, was your understanding that, oh, this person is also black? It was never like, oh, how are you black and I'm black? Was it just something you automatically knew?
Because of the work that my mother was doing, because of the activist work that my mother was doing, I grew up in Black churches with Black people, watching them pray for a free South Africa, watching people of all colors, work and zabalaza for a free South Africa. I grew up with Black communities that would hold hands and barapele and pray like with tears in their eyes. I watched Black communities in the US, Black immigrant communities, weep with joy when Mandela came out of prison, as though Mandela belonged to them, So I mean, my understanding of what it means to be a Black person in the world was formed in that space. As much as it was also formed in my house and with my parents, it was formed in that space. So I mean, when we were learning about slavery, we would come home and my parents would be like, okay, what lies are they telling you about this? And we would sit and talk about, well, that's a lie, and that's a lie, and that's a lie, and that's a lie. And then I'd go back to school and say to my teacher, but this is a lie, actually.
You know what's so scary? Those of us, I mean, I would say, I was in a multiracial private school in 1990, and I also had those experiences. So Malusi, let me jump in there. What was your experience and understanding of Blackness? And I think the reason this conversation is important is because some people that come back from exile come back with an accent through no fault of their own, and it's almost like their Blackness is diminished. You're not really, no seteng kind of a thing.
Well, for me, the part that really also had a big impact on me is when we now stayed with my sister in the UK. So my parents had to leave for the States. So they left us with my sister. We went to her place because now she was already in the UK as well.
And this is an older sister.
This is my older sister.
Yes.
And she was a lot more active, with the activism and everything. And that's when I think I got exposed to a lot of the conversations, because the TV was always glued on what's going on, and also the people that would come visit, they were very different,
Different in what way?
They were a lot more vocal, they were a lot more loud, they were a lot more, charged, there was a lot more energy and spirit, and, and obviously what changed for me, we were vegan now, all of a sudden. Because that was her lifestyle. Yeah,
wow.
We were vegan. Churches changed. We went from being Anglican, because I was a server as well, to Seventh Adventist. And I think I became a lot more aware of my place in the greater makeup, but also at home, because she had kids, I had now nephews, so there were more kids to respond to, and I was a lot more responsible to them, just like you would be in a South African household, and it gave me, I think, time to myself to say, okay, fine, if I'm going to kind of survive this, I'll need to be a lot more, clued up with what was going on. And funny enough, it almost prepared me for the move to the Netherlands, because that's when I was already aware that, okay, we're going to enemy camp. We're going to, the Dutch sounds like Afrikaans.
And did you deduce that on your own, or somebody actually told you? And why the Netherlands? Because a person would be thinking, excuse me, why of all the places, the Netherlands?
There was a large network with the anti-apartheid active. Like, there was a lady that actually was a family friend, because she had helped my father before. While they were that side, with the musicians, the Amandla troupe, and the many programs that they had that allowed them to travel. The Netherlands was a safe house. Was a place where they could actually go and seek refuge because
no one would suspect that black people would be hiding there.
Well, they were quite vocal. They've been very vocal, the Dutch, before, especially since the Second World War, about, human rights, civil rights. So there was a lady there, Tineke van den Klinkenberg, who was obviously one of the volunteers. And she opted to take us in. She's like, listen, you go to the States, I'll take your 2 kids. And this is us now. We had met her before. She had visited us in the UK, but now we're going over to another place, another language,
starting
another
afresh.
Culture, left my friends behind, but this time I'm also leaving family behind because my nephew was there as well, my 2 nephews and niece. But this time I'm a bit more aware of my skin.
Next time on Unpacked.
There isn't a race that is better at loving than another race.
But you listen to Malusi's story, it's trauma after trauma after trauma after trauma as a baby.
The truth of the matter is I was always jealous of everybody else for having so much access to my father.
Were you scared? Like that plane ride back?
Yes. Honestly, yes.
That's Unpacked with Relebogile Mabotja. New episodes weekdays at 5:30 p.m. on my YouTube page. Don't forget to subscribe. Television edited broadcast weekdays at 5 p.m. Open up with S3.